I'm going to share with you something that we presented originally to some of the city councilors as our subcommittee on short-term rentals started its work back in earnest, really in 2015. You guys, veterans from NEWNC may remember, there was an application for a variance for a 5th story to be added to a building on Battery Street. And it turned out that this building was it was run entirely as an Airbnb, although the person who was making the application denied wholeheartedly that there was ever an Airbnb there. And this is how we sort of learn the mysterious, stealthy world of Airbnb, where people often say things that they're not doing and don't say what they are doing. And they did not get the variance, fortunately, for the 5th story in this building. They sold the building and it's no longer an Airbnb. And I'm not trying to illustrate that all Airbnbs are bad. That is not our presentation at all. But what we did learn is that there seems to be a bit of a problem, a little bit of an out-of-control nature of short-term rentals. So we started our working group, and it worked for a couple of years, gathered information, and we came up with these slides, which have been shared with city councilors, including our newest one who joined us, and also the mayor's staff, Joyce Lenahan and Sheila Dillon and John Barros and others. Assuming that you can sort of read around corners, I will just say there is an ordinance that some of you guys may have heard about, and some may know pretty intimately. The mayor has submitted an ordinance. It's going to be debated tomorrow in a lengthy city council hearing beginning, I believe, at 10 o'clock. And this ordinance essentially proposes to restrict certain elements of short-term rentals, Airbnb and others. The ordinance proposal is allowing an unlimited number of market rate resident occupied units and an unlimited number of investor units to be rented short time, but putting a 90-day ceiling on those. So in other words, there's no restriction on numbers, but there is a restriction on the number of days for entire apartment rentals. And the mayor is further proposing room rentals, which is also a part of Airbnb that some of you may be familiar with. Those are not going to have the same restrictions. They're going to have no restriction in terms of the number of days that they can be rented.
Quick question for you.
Yeah.
The 90-day rental, the first thing you mentioned, is that 90 days per year or is that 90 days?
90 days per year. Thank you for asking. Yeah, so that essentially means you can rent 3 months out of the year, but after that you're in violation of this ordinance. The other thing that the ordinance doesn't talk to really, and this is pointed out in our presentation, is that safety standards are equivalent to apartment standards. And as you know, with the recent ordinance on apartment inspections, it's sort of once every 5 years. Usually in a hotel, you'd have extra sprinklers, CO detectors, extra inspectional requirements. A Class A hotel inspection in the state of Massachusetts is a once a year inspection rather than once every 5 years. So that sort of was a little surprising. And the last major feature was an ISD-run registration process where fees are going to be asked for all of the various hosts. $25 a year for room rentals, $100 a year to host entire resident apartment units if you're a resident, and $500 a year to host entire apartment rentals if you are an investor. So investors are allowed to be in the market. They're paying a little more in fees, but that's really the only difference between them and regular owners. Problem is illustrated in this slide. Maybe I can get it to look a little better if I push this over here. But on this slide, it shows. I'm probably going to kill it entirely. Boston ownership and the folks who list units in Boston are really pretty concentrated. When we look Boston-wide and downtown to see how many units are there, so Boston-wide 2,600 units, downtown 1,550 something units. When we looked at all the hosts, that number of units accounted, 1,527 hosts accounted for 2,600 units. But if you look at how concentrated it is, you get down to 2+ multi-unit hosts. 109 hosts are accounting for over half the supply of all Boston Airbnbs. That suggests that their multi-unit listers are important in our market. Downtown, it's actually much worse, and we are, as part of the downtown neighborhoods, the ADCO neighborhoods. Only 17 hosts make up, you can't see it on the slide, but it's 40% of the market. So just 17 entities. They're probably not people, they're probably businesses, although some of them do list themselves as people. So this got us scratching our heads as we were looking at the numbers. We asked ourselves, how do we compare to other cities? What we found was, if you look at the comparisons that we did between us, Cambridge, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., the ones you can't see are London and New York. First line is how many Airbnbs there are, and we're not the most dense. We don't have the most Airbnbs per acre. But if you take a look at Airbnbs that are not room rentals, but entire apartment rentals, the kinds that are sort of like hotels, we are more concentrated than most places. When you start getting into multi-unit owned, sort of chain-owned Airbnbs, an Airbnb that is owned by someone or operated by someone who offers 5, 10, 20 Airbnbs, a whopping 53% citywide and 60% downtown were uncovered in our first analysis. And then we looked at how many of those people actually own across neighborhoods, maybe have one in Fenway and one in the North End at the same time. And those are high numbers, again, 43% and 51%. We compared it to other cities using publicly available data, and we found that these numbers were exceeding other cities by oftentimes a factor of 3 or 4. So this is an incredible amount of concentration that we have, multi-unit concentration in the city of Boston. And that's a part of the big problem that we see in the market and what needs to be regulated. And without touching on, without the ordinance actually saying we need to pull back on investors, we're not really addressing the problem, and that's a bit of a concern for us. I wanted to show investor units sort of graphically. This is as much of downtown as my poor little machine is fitting on the screen. But these are investor-controlled units in this area. And if you add on non-investor units, you'll see that it is, a much smaller number of units come online. It's a 70-30 split, according to this analysis, in the downtown area. The data on the previous slide was compiled from data about a year ago. This data is fresh as of November. So this means we've got a 70-30 split of investor-controlled units, multi-unit chains, and regular residents offering their apartment out for 1, 2, or 3 months or whatever they're renting it for. That's pretty important, because we also looked at a lot of the studies that have been done nationally to see, what happens if you have this concentration of Airbnbs. What happened in New York City, for instance, when Lower Manhattan and Upper Brooklyn became essentially swamped by Airbnbs. And what we found in a study called Shortchanging New York City, that even a relatively small amount of listings, and they actually had a pretty large amount of listings by the end of the study timeframe, but the vacancy rate can be affected drastically. This chart shows, and I'm just going to focus on West Village, Greenwich Village, Soho, that the vacancy rate would have been 5%, which is considered not a great vacancy rate in New York City, but if you drop below 5%, they declare it a housing emergency. Because of Airbnb, it actually decreased significantly to under 3%. It was 2.9%. These are statistics that are very worrisome. Now, you could say, well, maybe that won't happen in Boston, but there was a UMass study actually done. not on the screen, but there was a UMass study called Is Home Sharing Driving Up Rents? That actually shows that already rents have been driven up by between 1.3 and 3.1%. In 2019, they're projecting, the UMass study that was recently completed, an extra 5% or on average $178 a month increase in rents, solely because of Airbnb, not because of all the other factors that might bump up rents. These analyses just basically narrowed in on let's control all the variables and let's just see what's correlated with rent rise if we vary the number of Airbnbs. This is what the regression analysis showed. So that again is worrisome. The other thing I wanted to highlight is that Airbnb has attracted a new breed of real estate speculators. Who read the Commonwealth magazine article on Airbnbs? I don't know if anyone reads Commonwealth magazine. Well, it's a good article if you get a chance to read it. It's online at commonwealthmagazine.com. There was a firm that was using a host named Anthony from the North End. Get it? And Anthony popped onto the scene in 2016. All of a sudden, in the North End, this guy didn't exist in 2015. In 2016, he had over 60 listings in the North End, 80 citywide. And a bunch of us were asking, who is this Anthony? I mean, I asked a bunch of folks. A guy called Sean. Do you know Anthony?
I don't know Anthony.
And because he's in the building next to you.
Yeah, I think
right. And so
I've seen Anthony.
Trying to figure out what is this Anthony. And there was a nice picture. Damn, it's too bad you can't see this wonderful picture of Anthony. He's such a wholesome looking guy. That's sort of his picture over there. He also had a bio. He likes to travel. He loves his wife, etc. But turns out we have one person on our subcommittee who's a researcher, sort of a scientist at MIT Lincoln Labs, and he used some software that I probably don't even want to know about to analyze this photograph and see where else it exists on the web. We found it on a bail bond site. We found it on an abortion clinic site. We found it on an evangelical Christian site. We found it on various summer camp sites and various loan shark sites.
Couldn't it be that just Anthony is just a busy and multi-talented guy?
Well, we think he's a happy-go-lucky guy who gets around. Or possible that there's another explanation. Or perhaps Anthony is actually not a real person. It turned out that Anthony is actually a New York City-based professional Airbnb lister speculator called Domio, whose business model is to scoop up leases by the dozen. And I have been in touch with several folks in the real estate industry who have been contacted by Domio, who, they typically, how many apartments do you have? I'll take all of them. And someone, I don't know how many people know Steve Mirabella, but his girlfriend, was relaying the story to me about in her office. The Domio people called up and someone said, hey, these guys, they claim that they're corporate short stay, executive suite kind of folks, but they're just going to put it on Airbnb. So they were challenged by the realtors. Are you going to put it on Airbnb? Oh, no, we're not going to do that. Finally, they were given some proof. The realtor emailed back to Domio proof that, look, clearly you guys are doing it on Airbnb. This is very reminiscent of that story I told you at the beginning where there was this fifth story that was applied for, and the people were saying, no, we're not an Airbnb. Well, when they received the proof, Domio just stopped calling this real estate firm and started calling others. So that's their business model. That's an emergent business model on Airbnb. This is really, I wanted to illustrate this because this is really the kind of business model we want to stop. It's purely speculative. It's an arbitrage. They're accumulating leases because they can, because we're not restricting them from doing that, and they're arbitraging them, getting 4 times what they could if they were just normal long-term rentals. They're also driving people out. I know in several buildings in the North End, people aren't necessarily being driven out to the street yet, but they're being driven out of apartments into other apartments because developer or owners are realizing we should develop the choice of use for Airbnb. And in fact, in Chinatown, it has gone further. Entire tenement blocks have been bought up, and people have been physically evicted. I'm sure some of those people are going to show up at the city council hearing tomorrow.
So we just, in respect to everybody's time,
Yeah,
so we're going to
sure.
be able to have some questions as well. So,
Okay. Well, I'm pretty much, that was my big finish. I wanted to just show you, this is what zoning should be looking like for Airbnb type rentals. This is where the rentals are, so there's another little flaw here in that our zoning code is not being enforced by ISD, which is troubling, but there's a reason for that. We can handle that in Q&A. And as I mentioned, fire safety is a concern. So just you know, the last thing is we really believe investor units should be disallowed, and more needs to be asked of Airbnb to help us rein in some of this terror. So with that, please.
So I'll open up to the council members for questions first.
What's the mayor's rationale for allowing 90 days?
Well, I think what they were trying to do is come up with the simplest formula possible that's the most executable, the most implementable, that it doesn't, you know, it doesn't blow ISD's brains out. You know, it's, you know, I don't want to pick on ISD, but most of the city councilors really think if you do something that's really complicated and ask ISD to do it, like come up with a very difficult way to enforce this, it's probably not going to work just because it's a complicated human system. So what Joyce Linehan, she told me she wanted something that was very simple. In 90 days, across the board is, I think, about as simple as you can get. My concern is that there are parts of this market where we need a scalpel to sort of carve out the speculators, but leave the homeowners, leave the honest people who are working hard, who need to make the mortgage and make the rent, rather than use a blunt instrument like, you know, 90 days across the board, no matter what your ownership structure is. Investors and homeowners are different, and I think we should recognize that.
But you play that out, let's just say 90 days is the law of the land. How do you even regulate it? How do you even keep track of it?
Well, I mean, and again, I'm not trying to diss ISD, but ISD is going to be the entity that controls it.
Right.
ISD, remember the previous ordinance was the rental registry. They wanted everyone who has apartments to register. I don't know what our compliance rate is right now on that, but last I checked, it was 28%. So, you know, it's like, and it's been how many years since that ordinance? So it is a legitimate question as to how you enforce it. Now, I think there are some really smart people in the mayor's office that realize that we can leverage Airbnb, like San Francisco is leveraging Airbnb to they basically have a deal with Airbnb where Airbnb will help register new people, and if those people get out of compliance, they can be thrown off of Airbnb. That's an Airbnb-only solution. They could always go to VRBO or some other place. But you know, that's how you start to enforce it, is you work with Airbnb, and that's why we want to ask more of Airbnb.